All right, good afternoon. Is everyone so quiet, eating? So are you all enjoying today? Yes. Have you learned something new? Have you met a new person? Yes, awesome. So I have the honor and the privilege to introduce to you all our keynote speaker. And, I always say, every time I talk about Dr. Laura Ullrich, how amazing she is at sharing information and the data. I am very much a people person, not very technical, and so whenever she is sharing information, the way that she's able to share it and just relate to everyone, you all are really, really in for a treat. And so I have actually had the chance to hear her share and speak multiple times, and I am always blown away with the information that she shares and just the way that she's able to share it. Her research includes a focus on the economic impact of local development or workforce development, education, local and state level tax and expenditure analyses, and more. She is an active member of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg community. She currently serves on the executive committee of the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance and the board of the Catawba Regional Council of Governments. And today, she is really going to share with us about some of the key trends that are impacting both job seekers as well as employers. She also has a heavy focus on higher education, community college education, and today she's going to share with us some research that was actually just released that is about the misalignment of credentials and education. And so I know that that's been a lot of what we have also talked about in partnership, Charlotte Works, the city, the county, CELC, really making sure that the skills and credentials that our job seekers are earning really do lead to meaningful employment opportunities. And so please help me welcome Dr. Laura Dawson Ullrich.
Thank you so much. That's so sweet. Thank you so much, Ann. I'm really happy to be here today. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. Number one, because of the group of people I knew would be together here today, and I know many faces in the room, but lots of new faces too, so really, really happy for that. But also because of the topic I get to talk about, because this really is where my kind of personal passions lie as an economist. So I'm going to start out with a really brief economic update today because as a Federal Reserve economist, I just can't help myself but to talk about that a little bit. And then I'm going to go really more deeply into my views on workforce development, credentials, and kind of the future of work. So, and just as a FYI, my job is I'm the senior regional economist for North and South Carolina for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, so I'm based right here in Charlotte, and I cover both states. So since I work for the Federal Reserve, I always get to remind everyone that the views I'm going to express are mine alone and don't represent an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. I always have to do this, but it really is important to me when I talk about this topic because I am going to give you my own personal views about what I think work looks like from now until the end of my own career. What does workforce development, what does employment look like? All right, so where are we now in terms of the economy? So 2023, almost all economists thought 2023 was going to be a flat growth year at best. A lot of people thought we were going to be in a recession. I never really saw the recession coming, but we weren't expecting a whole lot in terms of growth. We were wrong. 2023 ended up much stronger than expected. So far, 2024 has been a little bit anemic in terms of growth. The GDP estimates for Q1 were revised and came out yesterday at 1.3%, but still seeing positive growth. This is especially true in places like Charlotte and Raleigh. I'm going to show you data on employment across the state and what it looks like, and you will see that Raleigh is far outperforming the rest of the state. But then behind Raleigh is a group of metro areas that include Charlotte that are also performing quite well. Really, the part of the economy that has shocked me the most as an economist is what has happened with consumption, which is that it has remained high. So real consumption, after you account for inflation, continues to climb. Part of the reason the economy is not growing as fast this year is that it has slowed down some, but not near as much as I might have expected given the increase in interest rates that we've seen, along with accumulated inflation. Part of the reason for this is that wage growth, now, if I were to poll people even people in this room, most of you may not believe this next statement I'm going to make, but it actually is true, that wage growth is more than keeping up with inflation. So if you actually look at 2019 compared to now, we have had a tremendous amount of inflation, but we've had more wage growth. So people actually have seen increases in real wages, which makes them spend more. Another thing that's happened, though, is that asset values have gone up. So those of you in the room that own a house, if you bought it pre-COVID, it's worth a lot more now than it was before. If you own just about any asset, if you own gold, if you own Bitcoin, if you own whatever, the values are higher today than they were previously. That leads to what we call the wealth effect, which is people feel wealthier, they spend more money. That being said, credit card debt is up pretty significantly, and I was looking at some data yesterday that showed that severe credit card delinquencies, so delinquencies that are more than 90 days, are up to levels we haven't seen since 2009. Yeah. So at some point, like, you would expect to see maybe consumption kind of calm down, right? At some point, people cannot continue to leverage themselves like that, but we just haven't seen it yet. So because of all this demand, inflation remains above our 2% target, and interest rate cuts, you know, a lot of people were hoping that there was going to be a cut early in 2024. That did not happen. And the longer the inflation data looks the way it does, the longer it's going to take to see some relief in interest rates. I do want to really point out, and I'm going to talk about this a couple times in my presentation, that so much of how the economy is doing, and so much of workforce development, like kind of the current and future state of workforce development, is determined by where your feet are planted. And so we're in a place in Charlotte that is growing relatively rapidly compared to the rest of the country, but you could drive an hour in any direction, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, and get to places that are losing employment and have been losing employment for decades. So when I go and do a talk like this, in some of the communities I go to in the Carolinas, like Eastern North Carolina, for example, you know, I did an analysis recently of in Eastern North Carolina, what has happened to their school district enrollment since 2000, and it's down over 50% in some of those communities. So imagine that, right? So not every community is experiencing the same kind of growth, even if you are in a state that's doing well. That's important for us to recognize. And then I'm going to focus a good bit on, as we get further into it, I hope I get through all my slides. If I don't, I said they can share these with you. You can see them after. But one of the things, I like to be a realist. I'm kind of an optimistic realist. I want to be honest about what the data are showing, but then give you some ideas of what I think are kind of the ways past forward that could be really great. We're seeing the percentage of opportunity youth, so youth that are disengaged, we're seeing that decline slightly, but what we are seeing is that every year fewer high school students are going to college right after high school, and that's all types of college. And this year, if you have not been following what is happening with the FAFSA, you need to be following that. I've written several pieces on it. I'm obsessed. I track the FAFSA daily. And this year, the FAFSA completions are down almost 16%. That year over year, that is the best predictor we have of what fall enrollment will look like this fall. So those of you that are in the room that work in higher ed, I know you are thinking about this, but everybody ought to be thinking about it because there's still time to encourage young people to fill out the FAFSA. So the percentage of students that are going to college has been going down. And when I say college, I mean community college, other types of training institutions as well. But starting next year, we hit what is called the 2025 cliff. And after that, the number of high school students graduating every year begins to decrease. Okay, so this is kind of two things colliding at the same time. The absolute number of students beginning to decline, and this is because of declining fertility rates. At the same time, fewer students are going to college as a percentage. And so in my opinion, it is going to become more important than ever to engage people at young ages, right? I mean, very young ages, but especially kind of those transition periods out of high school. All right, so let's look at the economy just briefly first. You can see this is real GDP growth. You can see the strong growth that we had in 2023. And real GDP growth, means real GDP is the value of all final goods and services produced in the United States in a given year. Real means we've adjusted for inflation here. So you can think of this as like the pile of stuff, goods and services that are made in the United States. On the far right, you'll see FOMC projections. Every other FOMC meeting, the FOMC is the group at the Fed that votes on interest rates. They make projections on what they think is going to happen in the economy. And you'll see that they're projecting around 2% growth for the next 4 years. That means they are not projecting a recession for the next 4 years. That does not mean a recession will not happen the next 4 years. Don't want any of y'all coming back to me whenever and reminding me of what I said. What it does mean is looking at the data today, there is nothing that says there's going to be a recession. But recessions typically come unexpectedly. If you look at events that have caused recessions, 2001, it was kind of a combination of September 11th and Enron failing. Obviously, the great financial crisis. There was a lot that happened in that situation, but Lehman Brothers failing was kind of the domino that got it falling. We had the short COVID recession, right? So typically, we say in my field of work, these economic expansionary periods that you see like right here and here, we sometimes say they don't die of old age, they're murdered. So we don't expect it, and then we wake up and it's like, okay, we're going to be in a recession. But right now, there's nothing in the data that makes us think that is imminent. This is real consumption. So this is how much people put in their shopping cart. And when I say shopping cart, I mean all the goods and services that you buy, so including childcare, including healthcare, everything you purchase. You can see overall, the top line is overall consumption. This is what I've been shocked has continued to climb the way it has, given cumulative inflation. If you look from the period of time where inflation really took off, about 3 years ago now, compared to now, we've had over a 20% price increase. That's a huge increase. So prices have gone up 20% and people have put more in their cart. How have people put more in their cart? Well, some people saved a ton right here. I mentioned asset values, they're higher. That's a way people have put more in their cart. In the middle of COVID and right after the initial COVID waves, some of this was about direct government stimulus to people's pockets, right? So there's a whole host of different things that happen that are kind of atypical that have allowed consumption to remain as high as it is. But you can see if you look at real consumption, it is much higher now than it was pre-COVID. That's demand side. Demand going up can increase prices, right? We know that. We all know if something becomes more popular, the price goes up, right? But what can also increase prices is supply shocks, supply declining. We had that as well during COVID. And you can see here that that has normalized. This is a very good sign that that has done that on its own, because actually the actions of the Federal Reserve are more designed for demand. So because of this, inflation came down a lot last year, and a lot of that was probably supply driven because of the picture that I just showed you. So in 2023, inflation plummeted really. And then in 2024, it's been steadier. And this has been driven mostly by sticky prices and prices that are going up a bit in shelter costs, so rent and owner-occupied imputed rent, and services. Okay, that's where most of these price increases are coming from, or the lack of them declining. The Federal Reserve has been really clear, the FOMC has been really clear that they are going to keep interest rates higher until inflation is coming down to that 2% target. So sometimes people say to me like, well, it's 3%. That's like pretty close to 2%. But mathematically, that is really far from 2%. So it sounds close, but it's not. And especially not for the way the Fed measures it. So most people think we're at the top rate where we're going to be. The question is, how long do we stay there? You can see from previous cycles, we typically don't stay at the top very long. But let me also point out that all of those sharp declines you see in interest rates there were triggered by recessions. So if we don't have a recession, if we have this soft landing, we might see it look like stair steps coming down. It could look quite different than what we've seen previous cycles. All right, so let's turn to employment, and then we're going to go into workforce stuff. So this is national employment. We are well above pre-COVID employment, but we haven't returned to the pre-COVID trajectory. So if you look here, this blue dotted line is where we would have been basically if COVID never happened. And also let me point out that if I drew a line from here, from pre-Great Recession, it would be kind of like this. We never recovered to that. Economic disruptions, especially severe recessions or something chaotic like COVID, have long-lasting impacts. Some of them can actually be pretty permanent. And so nationally, we just haven't recovered. I will say last month, this 175,000 job announcement was a relief for me. I've been waiting to see one in the hundreds for the past few months. And the reason I'm saying that is because we need to add about 80 to 100,000 jobs a month to keep up with population growth. If we add more than that, then that is expansionary. And if we're expanding employment, wages go up and inflation goes up. So if we want inflation to come down, we don't need this number to be negative. That is not necessary. But when you're adding 315,000 jobs in 1 month, that is extremely expansionary. So 175 was I was happy to see that one. So nationally, we haven't gotten back to that pre-COVID level, but in North Carolina, we have. So in North Carolina, we are pretty far above where we would have projected back in 2019. And once again, if you were to draw out this kind of Great Recession, we're back to that point. So things look very different here than they do in much of the rest of the country, and we're all feeling this, right? We are feeling all the new people moving to the state for these jobs, right? We are feeling, I don't know about you guys, but my commute into uptown Charlotte is horrible now. Oh, yeah. It used to be like pretty bad. Now it is horrible. So we feel this, right? We know people are coming in. And you can also see that North Carolina added 10,200 jobs in the most recent jobs announcement, which is a lot of jobs for the state. So what does it look like by metro area? I told you I was going to show you some data on this. So this is the employment change from February 2020 to the most recent data that we have, which is April. And you will see that Raleigh is leading the way pretty significantly. Jacksonville, they had a base expansion there, so those are federal government jobs. Wilmington has done really well. Lots of retirees moving to Wilmington, but that generates employment, right? Retirees spend a lot of money. They go out to eat a lot, so there's more employment there. But you can also see that even though North Carolina has done so well, right? Like I'm telling you, nationally, we haven't recovered to pre-COVID norms, but in North Carolina, we have. If you look at this, there really are just 3 metro areas that are contributing to that. It's Raleigh, Wilmington, and Charlotte, because Raleigh's got Durham there too, right? Everybody else is below that national or that state average, and many of the MSAs are below even the national average. One thing I'll point out to you is that employment growth is not always tied super closely to population growth. And an example here I will give you is Asheville. Asheville has seen pretty strong population growth, but many of the people that have moved to the Asheville metro area have moved there for the express purpose of not working. Yeah. I wish I could do that as well. And some of them are my age. Like, there's some story there that I'm just not a part of. But there are a lot of retirees that moved there, but Asheville has a major issue with housing and availability of land, right? There's buildable land is a huge issue there. So whereas Wilmington, retirees moving into the area has allowed that metro area to really grow out and expand, Asheville is much, much more complicated. So you can have places that are seeing strong population growth where employment growth lags. The exact same thing is happening down in like the Beaufort County, Hilton Head part of South Carolina, where they have had really strong population growth, but employment growth has been a struggle for them. So what does this look like across the state by urban and rural demographics? This looks at the percentage of employment growth Urban is brown, rural is green. The darker the color, the stronger the growth. And you're going to notice a few things about this map. First of all, you'll notice that much of this employment growth is, like I just showed you, centered around Charlotte, Raleigh, and Wilmington. But it's not just the core county, right? It's the broader counties around it as well. And then you'll notice the green counties that have seen growth are in one of two places, either on the coast or in the mountains. They're tied to some natural amenity. Now, what is interesting about some of this is that growth tends to follow a few, there's many things that impact economic growth, but if you look at where communities grow, especially rural communities, they oftentimes do grow around natural amenities. And actually, if you look at the biggest cities in the United States, they were created around natural amenities, right? They were created near water mostly. So Chicago has a very big lake if you've ever seen it there. New York obviously is an island, right? Los Angeles is on the ocean. They're near big bodies of water. And so their growth is constrained by that at some point, right? As are these rural communities that begin to grow, and there are mountains, right? Or there are lakes or whatever. Charlotte and Raleigh do not have a natural boundary. So in theory, these places, same with Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Atlanta, they can just grow and grow and grow and grow. And that's basically what we're seeing. I grew up northeast of Atlanta, Georgia, in Athens, Georgia. And we had a demographer come to my 7th grade class when I was in 7th grade with like the VHS tape. And he showed us a video of what he thought, he was like a futurist demographer. He showed us a video of what he thought the night sky was going to look like in the southeast. I can't remember how many years in the future, but what he basically showed was Atlanta and Charlotte growing into each other. And I thought it was the dumbest thing I had ever seen because my family had friends in Anderson, South Carolina, and if you drove from Atlanta to Anderson, there was nothing. There was nothing. So I thought, this is ridiculous. And now I want to find that guy and be like, you were exactly right. I mean, this is exactly what's happening, right? Because if we look at where people want to be, they want to be around amenities. They want to have easy access from point A to point B. Companies want to be able to transport their goods easily from point A to point B. So the fact that we have ports nearby that can help with that, and rail access and interstates and all of those things make a huge difference. And we are not geographically constrained like many of the big cities in the United States. So that is a positive thing for growth, but that also creates stress, right? That means people's commute times are getting longer, and the stress on public utilities and things like that are more severe. One interesting thing I wanted to show you just really quickly is that Charlotte really post-Great Recession until COVID really outperformed the state overall. So this has North Carolina, the Charlotte MSA, and Mecklenburg County. And Mecklenburg County and Charlotte outperformed the state in terms of employment growth. And recently, these things have converged. This has converged. And a lot of this convergent mathematically is about Raleigh being so strong in terms of employment growth. And let me point out about Raleigh, because I know people in Charlotte get upset if Raleigh is outperforming anything. I'm not from the areas. I don't have a dog in the fight, but Raleigh, it's not just the number of jobs, it's the types of jobs. It is the industries they're in, heavy life sciences, heavy technology. So, when the Apple deal was announced at RTP a couple years ago, and I don't know what the average salary is there now, like what the estimates are, but when the announcement was made, their estimate was that the average salary would be $216,000 a year. That's a lot of money, right? That Charlotte doesn't frequently get those types of big projects. So a lot of this is driven by sector. But it is important to note, as I mentioned, it does not every state is doing as well as we are. This looks at our whole footprint. So this is the 5th District of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And this indexes employment to 100 before COVID. You can see what percentage of jobs were lost and what percentage of jobs have been added back. And you will see that the Carolinas have been leading the way the entire time. And actually, in our district, they are the only 2 states that are above the national average in terms of employment growth. And Maryland and DC are below pre-COVID employment, and you can see Maryland went down last year. The workforce development and education research that I do goes across these states, so I spend time in the other states as well. And I happened to be in Annapolis about a month and a half ago now when the governor's budget came out and it slashed community college funding pretty significantly. And I was there with the community college system. And it was so interesting being in that space because the conversation in the space with the state government was, we are a shrinking economy, we are losing people, we are losing employment. Baltimore is expected to be the fastest shrinking city in America for the next 20 years, and we have to shrink our economy. So this is painful, but it's time to think about how we shrink it. I cannot tell you how different that is than the conversations in the Carolinas. The conversations in the Carolinas are like Charlotte and Raleigh are projected to be two of the fastest growing places. We're getting more tax revenue than we know what to do with some of the tax streams. We don't know whether we should cut taxes. It's true. Y'all look at some of those tax numbers. Dig into it. Don't let them fool you. It's a totally different conversation. It's a conversation about smart growth. How do we expand in a smart way? So I say that to point out that even with the stress of the growth that we're seeing, you would much rather be in that room than the room that's thinking about how to shrink an economy. That is a very tough space to be in. So be thankful for that. One thing that really doesn't look so great in terms of the data is labor force participation, and this is kind of where I'll start digging into my views on kind of what's going on and what we're going to see in the future. Labor force participation rates have not rebounded to pre-COVID levels. Now, some demographics have. I'm going to show you a bit of that. But overall, we are below where we were before COVID, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics is projecting this number to fall to 60.4%, so to about right here, by 2032. So we're projected to have much lower labor force participation rates by 2032 if we don't do something about it before then, right? This assumes kind of steady state policy, steady state, everything else. I like to take this chart, and those of you who've heard me present have heard me say this a million times, so forgive me for going back, but it's important. I like to take this chart back to 1948. I think we are in a similar spot to 1948 with some demographic challenges layered on top of it. 1948, post-World War II, very strong demand for goods and services. People wanted to consume stuff. But labor was tight, and there were a couple of reasons why labor was tight. One of them was not many women worked. Second reason was veterans came back from World War II. They created the GI Bill, which gave people the opportunity to go back to school for free. And so a lot of veterans took advantage of that and kind of exited the workforce for a period of time. And then many others either came back and retired or didn't come back, right? So labor was tight. But what happened was two big changes that then led to this massive increase in labor force participation between 1964 and 1990s. The first is women entering the labor force. So overall labor force participation rates went up 8 points. Female went up 17 points. The second thing that happened, though, is baby boomers. The first baby boomers turned 18 in 1964. That's right here, right before this starts to take off. And what basically happened is we went from having a giant generation of children to a giant generation of workers. And this generation of workers worked very hard. Baby boomers worked very hard. They also were the first generation where it was common to have 2 working adults in a house. They had way fewer children than their parents had, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they have a lot of money. The average baby boomer has $1.2 million at retirement, which is way higher than previous generations. So baby boomers, not every baby boomer is wealthy, right? There's plenty of baby boomers that aren't, but on average, they have a lot of money. So the problem now is that we don't have these demographic things to lean on, right? I'm looking in this room. This room is probably majority female. We might be able to find a few more to come in here to hang out with us. But there's a lot of women in the labor force, right? And the females in this room have had fewer children than their parents and grandparents did too. So the combination of those two things makes this labor challenge different. But one thing I want to point out is that this had been falling since 2000. There's a lot of very good research on why that is. And this, I'm not going to go into too much of this because it gets a little wonky, but basically there are two things contributing to the decline in labor force participation rates. One is the aging of Americans. People are living longer and their retirement ages have not changed very much. So you can pull Social Security at 67, right? Full Social Security, a lot of people still pull at 62. That age hasn't been changed. The 62 age hasn't been changed since it was instituted in the 60s. So that age hasn't changed, but life expectancy has grown. So we have a larger percentage of people who are retirees. But we also have, and so that's kind of that blue part of that decline that you see in that bar chart. But there also are these group trends that have happened. That's the green part, where people are working less, and some demographic groups specifically are working less. And I personally believe, and specifically the demographic group that has been impacted the most is white males without a college degree. This group was heavily impacted by the movement from being a manufacturing sector to the service sector, right? These jobs, especially if you think about kind of the Midwest corridor, places in the Northeast, where you could leave high school and go work at the Ford plant and make a good wage and have great benefits and retire after 30 years and have enough money to have 2 cars and send your kids to college, all that. That doesn't exist now, right? There are still manufacturing jobs. There are really good manufacturing jobs, but most of them now, the good ones, require some sort of skill. You're not going to go from a high school seat into those jobs, most likely. And they don't generally have the same sorts of benefits, you know, a pension after 30 years and things like that. So part of it is that. Part of it, too, has to do with changes in culture. I call it extended adolescence when I'm being nice. But this is a big issue. It's a big issue economically. It's a big issue economically because people are taking longer periods of time to kind of launch into adulthoods, and many are having what sometimes is called a failure to launch. But let me point out that it is my belief that this is also tied to that baby boomer wealth because someone is supporting it. That doesn't come for free. That doesn't come for free. So there's a very, very well done economics paper that shows that on average, millennial men work 15% less than their baby boomer fathers. So 15% doesn't sound like that much, but if you think of it in aggregate, it's actually a huge difference, right? You need 15% more people to, if that's the case. So they work 15% fewer hours than their dads, and if you look at what they're doing with that time, 75% of those hours not working are spent playing video games or other computer leisure. And that is the facts. Some of you guys know I have 3 teenage sons. My oldest actually just turned 20, so I don't have 3 teenagers anymore. I have like 2 teenagers and a 20-year-old. And I always joke that they hate that this is one of my areas of research because when they turned 15, I'm like, you have to have a job, you have to wear a uniform at your job, you can't work for my friend, you get fired if you don't show up. I'm like very strict about the job thing. But I had a mom victory this week because my oldest son worked at Harris Teeter bagging groceries. He's painfully shy. He hated this job, but he never complained. He went, but he did not like it because he had to interact with people, you know. But he just got an internship in data science with a large grocery store because guess what they loved? He worked in a grocery store. So they told him, he started this week, and they told him, you're getting this job because you worked at a grocery store as a bagger. So I was like, I told you. Yeah, no, y'all don't have to clap. It was actually pretty funny because y'all know he did not want to tell me this fact, right? He was like, I do not want this woman to think she was right, but I was right. But I bring up some of that because some of this is about culture and trends and parental signaling, and some of that can be worked on, right? There are ways we can educate young people and their parents about how some of this stuff works. I mean, I think we can work on this a bit. So I talked to you about how for some different demographic groups, labor force participation rates are actually up. The most growth we see is amongst black males. And very interestingly, for the first time ever, the gap between black male and white male labor force participation rates has closed. Okay? Now, this is great, except we've always wanted it to close. However, we didn't want it to close because one was falling so much, right? The idea is like, let's lift everybody up. But if you look at that decline in white male labor force participation, this is where most of the decline, like the fact that we haven't recovered, that's where it's coming from. These are mostly wealthy white baby boomers that have left, and also some of their children who aren't working. That's where we see most of that decline. White females also have not fully caught up, but almost have, and you can see black women have caught up. Now, this to me is a story of wealth inequality. White baby boomers have more wealth. They chose to leave the labor force. Inflation goes up. They can still stay out of the labor force. But what we've seen actually is black male labor force participation rate is up amongst all age groups, including over age 65, which tells us many of those men didn't have a choice but to come back. But interestingly now, overall, black labor force participation rates are above white, once again for the first time since it's been measured, and now it's pretty significantly above it. Now, as we talk about, because I'm about to talk in a minute about the matching of credentials, this doesn't mean the wage gap has shifted. Doesn't mean the wealth gap has shifted. This is, there's some good news here, but it doesn't mean these other things have gotten better. But some of that too is about what we call self-selection bias. What is self-selection bias? When we decide what to major in, when we decide what to study, right? Maybe a little girl was always told, you would be a great nurse, but a boy is told, you'd be an incredible doctor, right? Might lead to that person just self-selecting into the lower paying profession, even though she could be a doctor. And we see that a lot amongst minority groups as well as women. So what's happening here? I mean, the real story in all these labor force participation rates charts, the biggest one is that the 50-year baby bust is catching up with us. So when I have a big group, I like to do this exercise because it's kind of fun. I want you to raise your hand if one of your grandparents had 5 or more siblings. Okay, almost everybody, a lot of people. Okay, raise your hand if one of your parents had 5 or more siblings. Okay, still a lot. Raise your hand if you have 5 or more siblings. Okay. Okay, so first of all, this is the baby boomers having many less children, what you just showed. Okay, now raise your hand if you have 6 or more kids. Nobody. 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 Okay. So he must have a lot, though. He thought, how many you have? You got 5. Okay, so he's helping us out, but usually there is one. Usually there's one. That is what's happened. Okay, this is what's happening to labor, is people have chosen to have fewer and fewer children for a whole host of reasons. It is not one thing. It's a whole host of different reasons, but it is catching up to us, and you can see in 1970, the median age, so if we lined up everybody in North Carolina and pulled the middle person out, it was 26.5 years old. Now it's 39.4 years old. So a big difference. So, this is why all the time you hear about the average age of nurses is too high. The average age of CPAs is really high. The average age of a lot of workers is higher because of this, and it follows this fertility rate trend. So fertility rates, this is the baby boom. See the baby boom? Right here. These are baby boomers. And then these are how many children the baby boomers had. They had many fewer children. Why were they having fewer children? Well, remember one thing I told you, it was one of the first generation where it was common for the mother to be working, right? There were other reasons too. People began to move more for employment, so there was less connection to family. We have had just an ongoing trend of kind of secularization, and so you don't have as many Catholic families or other families that traditionally had a lot of children. But when I talk about the 2025 cliff, it comes from this bump right here. So it is normal during a recession to see a pullback in fertility and then see it rebound after a recession. And what happened with the Great Recession is we had a little bounce in fertility rates right before the Great Recession, and then since then it has just been on a steady decline. So we need every woman in America to have 2.1 children to replace ourselves. Has to be 0.1 because unfortunately not everyone makes it to adulthood. But it's 1.7. It's 1.7. So starting next year, we're going to have the most seniors we ever have graduate high school, and then from then it's a decline. And you can see it's a pretty steady decline. This isn't just like, it's not slightly declining, it's going down. And, you know, it is interesting because this could turn around, right? All of a sudden people could start having more kids, but in the research that I do, I don't see any signs that that would happen anytime soon. There's policies that could maybe improve that situation, but right now, that's not going to happen. So what's the big story is that labor is tight, and it's likely to get tighter. It's going to stay this way. So here, this is one of my favorite new charts that we have. We model worker demand and the labor force. And until just a few years ago, there was always more people in the labor force than we had demand for workers. In some periods of time, like right after the Great Recession, it was really bad. There were a lot of people who were unemployed, right? Unemployment rates were high. But then starting in about 2017, 2018, depending on where you are in the country, that flipped, and all of a sudden there were more jobs than there were people available because of the things I just talked about. And that is how it is likely to stay. The only thing that would really change this is if there was a significant pullback in worker demand that could come from a bad recession, which we don't really want to have happen, right? So what I'm going to challenge you guys with is the fact that then the only way to close this gap is to get more people into the labor force. We have to impact labor supply. And there are right now about 5.5 million people. This data is in the payroll employment report every month. Last month, there were like 5.6 million adults in America that said that they want a job, they are available to work, but they are not working and they are not looking for a job. Okay, I'm gonna say it again. They're available to work and they want a job, they're not looking, they're not working. Why is this? Some of you guys work with these people every day. I don't have to tell you who they are. They are people that are just as involved and have tried to find a job and it didn't work out after 2 years of looking, so they stopped looking. Or it's a mom with 3 kids who knows she can't afford childcare. Or somebody that doesn't have a car to get where they need to go. Or somebody who's in an abusive relationship, or mental health, or disability. There are so many reasons. We call these non-skilled job barriers. But all of a sudden, we need to know who these folks are. When we had more people working and wanting to work than jobs, these people have always existed, right? You can see this chart. It goes back to 2019. We've always had a lot of these individuals, but now we need to know more than ever. So I just want to remind you really quickly or let you know why the Federal Reserve cares about this. The Federal Reserve cares because we actually have 2 mandates. Everybody knows about the interest rate and inflation one, especially right now. But the other one is to work towards maximum employment. And maximum employment, you know, on the inflation side, we have this 2% target. We have this explicit target. But maximum employment, we don't, because the definition of that is a little bit subjective. But for me, the definition of maximum employment is not only for everybody to have a job, but for people that have a job that use their skills best and use their human capital, their knowledge, and their labor best. And so this is a graphic that we have that we put together that kind of shows what we're interested in, which is this path from education into the workforce. So there's kind of these 2 pipelines, an education pipeline, a workforce pipeline, and there's all sorts of exits from education into the workforce. You can choose to get a bachelor's degree. If you don't want to do that, you could get an associate degree, or you could get a 1-year certificate. But the problem is that people leak out of this pipeline. These 5 million people that want a job, that aren't working, a lot of them are people who've leaked out of the pipeline. They didn't finish high school. They got a high school diploma but don't have any real skills to match to a job. And so what we're interested in is how do we plug these holes in the pipeline, but B, how do we move people into the workforce in an efficient way, in ways that use their skills and talents the best. So we know from the data that the more education you receive in general, the more money you make. Now, we have a problem here with this some college, no degree category, because this includes people that took 1 class at college and dropped out, and it also includes people that have a welding certificate. right? It's anybody without a degree that did some college. So we do actually think that those with certain credentials likely make more money than associate's degrees. So we don't think it really would go completely stepwise if we had better data. But still, there's no doubt the biggest jump percentage-wise is from an associate degree to a bachelor's degree. And especially if you consider from just a high school degree to a bachelor's degree. So as I go through this talk of credentials, I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying we should move people away from bachelor's degrees and into shorter-term credentials. That is not my viewpoint. People that want a bachelor's degree and that is the best way for them to use their skills and talents, that is what we want them to do. They're likely going to be very successful doing that, and also the data tell us they'll be more likely to be in the labor force. These are labor force participation rates by educational attainment. But what I'm going to talk about is the people that don't choose that path or don't complete that path, because quite frankly, people are skeptical. There is no doubt I could sit down with somebody and explain to them in 3 minutes why going to college and getting a 4-year degree is worth it, for almost all majors. And the return on investment is quite high. But people are skeptical, and you can see, I know it's kind of hard for y'all to see, but this is opinion of US adults. 56% said earning a 4-year degree is not worth the cost. Factually, I don't think that's true, but people believe it, and perception is reality, right? So people are very skeptical. And as I told you, this is the exact same data for 3 different years. One of the reasons I went back to 2015 is sometimes I feel like right now we're like blaming everything on the COVID era, and this was happening before that. There were trends that were happening before that COVID probably accelerated, right? But every year, a lower percentage of students are going into college or community college right the fall after graduating high school. And this has been especially true for male students. So fewer people are enrolling. There are some flagship schools. There are some schools that are doing great in higher ed. Flagship universities are doing well for the most part. There's a few. West Virginia University, if you followed what's going on there, they've been struggling, but most flagships are fine. Elite private schools are fine. I don't know who in here read the New York Times article about Vanderbilt will cost $100,000 next year, and they're fighting people away. 35% of their students pay full freight at $98,350 this year. They're fine. Many of the HBCUs have done very well the past few years, especially because they got a lot of money from the stimulus, but then also many of them got money from Mackenzie Scott and other nonprofit money. But tuition-dependent private schools, regional public schools, and some of the smaller HBCUs are really struggling. This is not a good time for these institutions because of that data I just showed you. Fewer people are going to college. In some places, the number of high school seniors is shrinking, and so they've got a lot of issues to deal with. And the FAFSA stuff looks like this is not going to be a good year overall for higher ed, although I think it could be a good year for community colleges. So this looming reality remains with this 2025 cliff that we're just going to have fewer young people entering the labor force in education. So I want to talk, I just have a few minutes left, but I want to make sure I get through this. This is brand new research that came out this week by Georgetown, and it is about the misalignment between education, skills, and jobs, and it looks at providers of non-bachelor's degree, like associate's degree and below credentials. Right now, and well, in 2021, only 36% of jobs required a bachelor's degree or higher. So we don't need everybody getting a bachelor's degree, right? If everybody had a bachelor's degree, we would have a lot of people who are underemployed. We don't really want that, right? We want people to get into their jobs efficiently and to make family-sustaining wages. By 2031, though, that number is expected to go up to 42%, and overall, 72% of jobs are going to require some post-secondary education. So that's everywhere from, hey, just go take this one class to learn how to run a robot, to having a bachelor's or master's degree. Between now and then, so in that 10-year period, but we're already well into it, it's estimated that 31% of jobs will require an associate degree or below. So in order for us to meet that target, we need to both increase credential attainment, which has long been a goal. I mean, we have My Future NC, right, North Carolina, that is their goal, their primary goal. But what Georgetown asserts is that we need to pay more attention to the alignment of those credentials to jobs. And economies benefit when education, skills, and jobs are aligned. This is especially important for these middle skill workers. That's what this report focuses on. And so if you have this alignment, then employers can find the people they need, right, to work. The workers can find jobs in fields because they have credentials in high demand areas. But Georgetown asserts, and I strongly agree with this, that students having those job-ready credentials also benefits those that want to go on to get a bachelor's degree. And it benefits them in a couple of ways. If they successfully transfer and go work to get a bachelor's degree, while they're in school, they can get high-paying jobs, relatively high-paying jobs to support themselves, right? But another reality, though, is that while a huge percentage of community college students say they want to transfer, a low percentage of them actually finish with a bachelor's degree. So it also provides them with skill-ready credentials for if that doesn't work out, okay? So what does Charlotte look like? This report, you can look at different MSAs. And Charlotte, you're going to see in a second, I'm going to show you the North Carolina map and the national map. Charlotte looks better than a lot of places. But still in Charlotte, 39.7% of the credentials attained. So this is associate degree and below. There are 23 providers in the Charlotte MSA. So this is community colleges. This is private two-year schools. This is proprietary for-profit welding schools, things like that. 39.7% of the credentials are not aligned to the jobs that are available. And specifically, you can see that almost 30% have no occupational match. What does that mean? Most of these are associate degrees in general studies, humanities, things like that. But let me point out something that many of you may or may not know. The guaranteed admissions agreements that exist between a lot of community colleges and four-year schools, that's the path that gets guaranteed admissions. If you do your associate's degree in an applied science, so if you were to go get an associate's degree as a plumber, that's not the degree that is guaranteed admission into North Carolina four-year schools, okay? So there's reasons why people choose a general studies associate, and it's generally going to be because they want to transfer and they want to do this path that is set out for them that's supposed to be the smoothest. So what Georgetown asserts is that actually these students would probably be better served with skill-matched degrees. Now, they don't say there's no value in these general studies associates. There absolutely is. There's value to higher education that goes beyond the piece of paper you get. Everybody in this room knows this. But they do assert that we should be paying more attention to this. And you can see that in the Charlotte area, the two areas that are way underserved are blue-collar jobs. This is all the technical jobs. And then also sales and office, which is really interesting. So this would be things in like management type positions and credentials that would help people get those sorts of jobs. Compared to the rest of the state, the Charlotte area actually looks pretty good. And compared, this is kind of our footprint. You can see Virginia is quite misaligned. They have a higher percentage of people there that have bachelor's degrees and lower percentages that have blue-collar credentials. But still, I think there's a lot. This report, you can get it online. If you Google skills misalignment Georgetown, it'll come up. You can get it for free. It's very well done. I find this very, very interesting because we have made some of these policy decisions like these guaranteed admissions paths. Some of those decisions were made many years ago at this point, and things have changed. The labor force has changed, demand has changed, and so maybe it's time to think about some of those things. So potential solutions really, really quickly. Encouraging youth to develop into these high demand fields. Some fields, nursing, welding, computer science, accounting, data analytics, they're in higher demand than ever. Unfortunately, student enrollment in some of these fields is shrinking every year because they're hard. But are they actually harder? I don't know. I'm an economist, so I like nerdy stuff. But encouraging them to develop in those fields and providing training programs and education that appeals to them. And that leads to flexibility. We are not going to be employers like we were 20 years ago. We are not going to educate students like we did 20 years ago. It's not going to work. Younger people demand very different things, and that's okay. It makes all of us uncomfortable, including myself. But we have to think about flexibility. That's not just about remote work. That's also about what expectations we have of people, the time of day they work or take classes or whatever. I also think this next one, promoting leaders in the space with lived experience, is super important, because many of us that work in this space, and we're doing really good work, we're all working hard, we don't have the lived experience of what it feels like if you did drop out of high school and you tried to get back on that path. And quite frankly, sometimes when we screen in HR using our HR techniques for positions in our organizations, we don't necessarily have the flexibility to allow those people a place at the table to talk about it. And so that's something we have to really think about. I think there are policy initiatives. I think policy is super important. I'm a policy economist. I'm always going to think that. I just mentioned changing in recruiting philosophies. And immigration cannot solve this problem, but immigration can help. And there are ways that could be a path forward. So where do we go from here? You know, labor supply is going to be tight because of demographics. There's no doubt about that. So my belief is that now, you know, less than 50% of high school graduates ever make it into the labor force in the long term. So now, when somebody drops out of high school, I want them to be thought of as half a lost worker. That's how I want to be thought of. We just lost half a worker. Go find out where that person is going. We need them back over here. We're going to find a way to use their skills and talents. It does not mean they don't have skills and talents, right? We can engage them, and I think now we have to do that. And like I said, younger people have different expectations. There's generational differences. There's things that were because of the pandemic, but we have to adjust to some of that. Innovation is going to help with this. AI is going to play a role. We don't know what role yet, but what we do know is we're going to need more people with high-tech credentials than ever to run the AI. So none of us want that to go amok. So we don't know the overall impacts, but they're going to be significant, but we have to be ready to manage those, and we need people with the skills and talents to do that. So I appreciate your time today. I'm out of time, but I'm happy to talk to you after too. Thank you guys so much.